Welcome back. Well, if you just joined us, you're still watching KTN Prime, and right now we are shifting gears to our discussion tonight, talking about Kenya's debt outlook. And my panel is already in studio. I'm happy that they have chemistry. You know, sometimes it's very difficult to have guys who don't have chemistry. But again, I've never experienced it, but I would imagine how difficult it can be. I'm happy to see you all. Seems like you all know each other. I guess it's the field, right?
Yeah.
So on my very near right, we have Johnson Derry, who is a finance expert. Thank you, Johnson, for making time.
Yeah.
And in the middle, there is the beautiful lady called Nelly Chepkemoi, who is a policy and advocacy manager of We Care organization. Thank you for making time. And of course, also Ken Gishinga, who is the chief economist at Mentoria Economics. Lovely to see you.
Thank you so much.
I'm happy that you are here to discuss this very interesting topic here, talking about Kenya's debt outlook. I just want us to begin by looking at some of the figures we were able to, pick up from the recent Fitch Ratings, which affirmed Kenya's long-term foreign currency issue default rating at a B- with a stable outlook in January 2026. And as you see there, rightfully, the Fitch assessment of the Kenya debt January 2026 shows a stable outlook and rating. The B- rating signifies, as according to some analysts, a high credit risk, but recognizes stabilized external liquidity. Of course, we also have improved gross forex reserves, talking about rising to roughly 1.6 trillion, providing a buffer against external payments pressures. And also we have stabilized external liquidity, not forgetting also fiscal deficit, which is, according to this assessment is said to remain high due to revenue shortfalls. And of course, also 2027-2028 Eurobonds refinancing was highlighted in the assessment, talking about successful refinancing of the Eurobonds, reducing immediate default risks. And also we have interest payments, which are said to remain high according to this assessment, and reliance on commercial borrowing highlighted as well, and potential social and political pressures on spending also taking prominence in this particular assessment by the Fitch Ratings. By the way, Fitch Ratings is an international credit rating agency that has maintained, again, as we've mentioned, Kenya's long-term foreign currency issuer default rating at B-. And by the way, also to mention, the high debt service costs, substantial fiscal deficits and governance concerns continue to constrain the rating, and this according to this particular assessment. I know these figures sometimes they don't make exact and immediate sense, and that's why you're here. Layman's language, help us understand the numbers. I just want to hear from you, Johnson. What do you make of this recent assessment by the Fitch agency, looking at the ratings? Makes sense for us. What are they saying?
Okay, so Fitch, Moody's, they are credit rating agencies, and their job is to rate. When you're rating, what you're doing is you are establishing probability of default. Now, they've given both sides of the argument, which I understand. But I think the interesting dynamic for me, first of all, we're talking about half of Kenya's debt, because that's what is in dollar. This is a dollar rating, so they're looking at dollar debt. So there's a probability of Kenya defaulting on our dollar debt as opposed to general debt. But from an external perspective, I think things ought to have improved because if you're following the U.S. Dynamics in the U.S., because they're the issuers of the dollar, I mean, the dollar index has essentially collapsed. I think in the past maybe 12 months, we probably lost more than 10%. So that should make Kenya, it should give Kenya breathing room in terms of accessing dollars, and we've seen it in the dollar buildup. So we are able to acquire more dollars because it's easier, it's cheaper now, because now they even just going by the dollar index, dollars are more accessible.
All right, Nelly, let's hear from you. Looking at what Johnson is saying, the dynamics with the dollar that has been witnessed in the recent months, and talking about at least is a gap, or rather a breathing window for Kenya. What are your thoughts about this particular rating?
I
think I'm going to compare it as a second time we are rating ourselves, because I remember last year we invited the IMF to do the same, and we invited IMF to come and conduct something we called a governance and corruption diagnostic. And the report from IMF, they just didn't give us the B- status, but the status they provided for us is that we are in, it's like the country is in a fiscal kind of crossroad. Because, and when you look at that, for me, I'm looking at 4 angles to be specific. This shows that there's a gap in terms of our governance. There's a gap in power, because this debt in the country is also being determined by some of the decisions made by the people in power. So when you look at that, I'm also looking at, in terms of the public trust, where is it? And as my colleagues might decide to focus on the external side of the debt in our country, I will decide to look at the domestic one, the local, which I think many times often goes undiscussed in our fiscal discussions. And I think sometimes, or rather more often, that is where the gap is. We're also facing a situation of having a citizenry that is a bit uninformed, or you could say that, or rather having a less urgency that is not so dominant when it comes to public debt. And so for me, this rating really shows the gaps that we're experiencing in our governance system. And when you look at the other side of it, right from June 2024, we are seeing a trend where the debt is surpassing our GDP by, I think we are currently at 65%. And there's impact to that. We are seeing that manifest itself with how the country is being run in terms of development. When you look at the education sector, for example, look at what is happening in the transition of grade 10. So these effects and the rating of the status, why we are even at B- shows that it is a red flag. It calls for that heads should start actually turning, that this is a call for action.
When we talk about a B- rating, Gishinga, what does that mean?
Many thanks, Leah. When that report came out on Friday, there were a lot of concerns that Kenya might be downgraded, which would have meant that the cost of borrowing would have been significantly higher. So there was a bit of relief that the report maintained Kenya at B- status. And in a sense, they tried to make a lot of arguments for Kenya. If you look at most countries that are in that range of B-, their interest payments to revenue ratio is normally at 15%. Kenya is about 30%. So this is essentially a student who has scored a B-, but was just a point away from a C+ grade. So it is a relief, but it points to huge concerns about our debt situation. Debt continues to crowd out the private sector. It continues to take away money from critical resources such as health, education, infrastructure. So that problem has not been resolved. In a sense, we've kicked the can down the road, and the government is being given another opportunity to try and exercise more fiscal discipline. So it is a relief, but it's by no means, we are by no means out of the woods.
And listening to what Gishinga is talking about, I like the way you put it. A student who was just close to scoring higher and just ended up with a B- and 30% you talk about. Johnson, just to also just delve deeper into this conversation, when you look at the Fitch ratings, where would you say Kenya is as far as solving the underlying structural problems of high debt and weak revenue?
Yeah, so bigger picture. By the way, our revenue growth is not, I wouldn't characterize it as weak. If you look at what we have done by December, we are talking about 1.16 trillion in revenues, up from 909 billion half year by the same time, 2024. The problem is the debt is growing faster, at a faster rate. And I always laugh about it, say these guys just can't stop spending because that's where the debt is coming from anyway. So the debt, and of course part of the reason spending is being driven by debt itself. So debt servicing. So I don't even look at the interest only, and I look at both from a cash flow perspective. I'm looking at both how much you're supposed to pay at any one time. And we're as at the end of this, as at the end of last year, we'd done 1.16 trillion in revenues, but we'd done 0.941 trillion. So just we're about to get there. Next year, certainly at this time, we'll be talking at least $1 trillion. The relief is coming from the dollar side because the Americans are messing up, but there's a lot going wrong. And if the Americans were to get their act together, we'll be in real trouble.
I mean, when you say in real trouble, what do you mean? I mean, how would it look if we didn't have that window of relief?
So it's a tough question because you're asking how exactly. But
when you talk about the relief itself because of the dollar, what impact has this had? If you can just make at least a bit more clarity on what that looks like for the Kenyan economy. What does it translate to for Kenya?
So, like, if you look at the exchange rate today, we're down to 128. But if the dollar remained tight, we'd be talking about 140 something right now. So it will be much harder. It will take more shillings to pay for our dollar debt. Now it takes a little less. Not by much, but it takes a little less. And that's the sort of relief I'm talking about, because we're talking about a huge amount of debt. So every change in shilling counts. So that's what I'm talking about. So what are we seeing now? Like Ken alluded to this, county guys are being paid later than they're supposed to. Hospitals are not being paid on time. Pending bills is growing. So we've got all these dynamics. That points to cash flow crisis. So what we have right now, and is undisputed, is we have a cash flow crisis. So every day the government wakes up and tries to figure out who shall we give the money to. So that's how it is. And of course, we're also still borrowing more, trying to cover the debt. And we are all we're doing is we are capitalizing our interest. So the debt is growing by the interest capitalization plus additional borrowing for spending that we're intending to do today, both recurrent and quote unquote development. So all that combined is driving us down the waterfall. If I may say that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And looking at this B- rating with a stable outlook, when we talk about a stable outlook, what does that mean? And let me just first begin with you, Ken. I know you did mention this, just to also bring and shed more light, give us clarity. When we talk about a B- rating with a stable outlook, what stability are we talking about here?
So the stability the report is referring to is stability in terms of exchange reserves, foreign exchange reserves, which are sitting at about $12 billion, about 4 months of import cover. The issue of the shilling remaining resilient at that 128, 129 range, and growth still being visible in some sectors. So basically that's the picture. What it's not able to speak to is issues of rising unemployment and how that could easily catapult into instability, as we saw in 2024 with the Gen Z crisis. It calls out as a potential risk when you have high levels of unemployment, almost 67% among the youth. Now that, because what we saw in June is something that could easily repeat very quickly, and it could disrupt. You remember how revenue collection after June 2024 really went down. So it can really hit the government's revenues. So those are one of the risks to that stable outlook that you referred to. Yeah.
All right. And just to also touch on something, Nelly, you mentioned some of the key risk areas. When you look at the debt, you've said it's rising because of also government expenditure. But what would you say are some of the key areas, Nelly, in your view, that are really causing this massive debt that Kenya is currently faced with?
So first I will start by saying that, and this might be taken as controversial, but debt is not really a bad thing. Because I believe in the Kenyan budget process, debt comes in that process. And so that is why I don't think it's a bad thing. But it becomes a bad thing when you see as to how it's, it's being exploited. As Ken puts it, and even as Joseph put it, the expenditure, when you look at our national revenue collection that the government collects in our country as taxpayers, I think even when we were starting this show, we should have just introduced ourselves as taxpayers first, So when you look at that, there's an impact because, so looking now at the budget now, 56% of our revenue that is collected in the country goes to servicing debt. And the impact of it, as my colleagues have put it, and is really huge and goes ahead and impacts negatively the most vulnerable populace in the country. That is the young women, the children, and the youth of this country. You've asked me of the specific sectors of priority. I will start with the one that I'm coming from, the education sector, for example. In this current financial year, like I've said, when you have 56% of our revenue going to servicing debt, you're remaining with close to 44% left of our revenue. So this 44% of our revenue is supposed to be allocated to these essential sectors, for example, the education sector, the health sector, for example. In this financial year of 2025-2026, in our budget for this financial year, we had a reduction of 2.8 billion, for example, in the in the basic education sector. And that money was meant for free education. So when you have something like that, that means you're systemically creating inequalities, for example, in the education sector. That means that money would have handled the free education part. And that is why we are seeing the confusion in the transition of grade 10 students in the country, because you're having the CBE that is supposed to be implemented with the pathways that are being introduced. But you have schools with that are not really equipped in terms of infrastructure. When you look at the teacher ratio in our classes, the students, you have a class that has one teacher and a ratio of students over 60. So the inequality comes in that. And for women or mothers in our community, for example, can put the value of the shilling. That woman will have to decide whether they are going to pay for food, they will pay for transport, or pay for medication, for example, of their children. So that is how it looks. And the stability will come in even when the government is trying to tell the youth of this country to try and be economically, or rather be their own bosses. You can't do that when you have the government portfolio being higher than the private sector, because as Ken explained, when they're crowding out private sector, that means the private sector is not able to hire young people. So there's massive unemployment crisis. It creates the insecurity hindering peace in the country. You have unrest, and even the aggressive high taxation that we're experiencing in the country is because of the debt that is coming in. And there was an analysis that was done by an organization called NDI that we are able to see when you look at our public debt, it is increasing at a rate of 17.9% per year. So that is really disturbing, because when you look at it, we are literally systemically creating inequalities for the future generations of this country. Yeah.
Well, I see Johnson has something to say. Let me hear your views, Johnson. Some of the key areas you feel that are really channeling this growth in the debt that the country is faced with at this moment. What are some of those key areas, and what has the impact been from these key areas?
Okay, but first allow me to correct you slightly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, she said it's 65%. Actually, as at December last year, we were doing about 81%. So for every 1 shilling, 81 cents goes towards debt servicing. So any expenditure, I mean, you only have like 19 cents of equity, and the rest has to be borrowed. And that's why, like I said, there's a government is experiencing a cash crunch. So what caused this, at least in my view, and by the way, this didn't start with this government. We have to go back all the way maybe to 2012 to see this phenomenon. When government started spending like drunken sailors, it was primarily, so there are a little bit of welfare spending. There's also capex, so like SGR, Lamu Port, which were investments that have not been able to pay for themselves. If you take a look at SGR, for example, as my favorite example, it's not even able to pay for its operating expenses just from the revenues. The operating expense is much higher than revenues. Forget about paying debt, right? So we have to borrow even just to fund its operations. And we see this a lot across a lot of SOEs in government. And that's why I'm also happy that we are beginning to privatize, because we need to get away with some of this deadwood from, because it's weighing down the tax victim, taxpayer. It's weighing us down, right? And it's making Kenya uncompetitive. So there's welfare spending, there is white elephants, but there's also a lot of waste, right? I won't even get to corruption, but there's waste. I mean, you've got duplicated roles at national and county governments, and national government is refusing to let go of the roles because it needs that money, and then there's a lot of duplicate. So all this combined is what is weighing us down.
Gishinga, if you look at what Johnson is talking about, and I know there's been also other conversations about some of the key areas that some analysts have felt have been eating into, or rather channeling more pressure on the debt crisis of the country. Some of the institutions like Kenya Airways, we've had conversations on other institutions other than Kenya Airways that some analysts have felt this companies or institutions have been promoting the debt rise in the country. Your thoughts on this?
When it comes to debt layer, there are two layers of explanations towards our public debt. There is what has been explained here, which is what most Kenyans are aware of, that government has spending pressures and it can't raise enough taxes, and a deficit naturally comes through. That's, for most Kenyans, the primary understanding of how we get into debt. There's also a second layer, a bit more sophisticated, and few people see that angle, in the sense that there is a lot of institutional funds that need to be invested in government debt. We have trillions of shillings out there that actually feed on this debt. Half of our pension funds sit in corporate and government bonds, bank deposits. So they need a place to be parked. So many people don't see that side. And that side is actually a far more powerful force, much more than the original one. If you go back to Kibaki's first year in office, he tried to run a budget surplus. In fact, it was the last time the government tried to run a budget surplus, where the revenue exceeded the expenditures. And immediately, the IMF called upon him and actually really discouraged him from pursuing that strategy, because the argument was it's going to collapse the bond market. So a lot of people don't see that angle, that there's trillions of savings, institutional savings, that need to be parked somewhere. And this government debt provides a home for that. And That is the deeper problem. We need to create more avenues for that institutional funds to go to other asset classes, into equities, into other segments. But for now, most of it goes into government bonds. So when you and I here might be complaining about our government debt increasing, there's a whole industry that thrives on that. And until we fix that and create more asset classes, we will always be in this perpetual cycle. So we have to create more investment asset classes for that pool of savings to go into. And that conversation is not, it's almost never had. It's a very distant conversation, but it's a driving force of what we have right now. If we were to pursue proper fiscal consolidation, we have to have an answer to where do these institutional funds go, what asset classes, and how do we create a good business environment where there is more investment opportunity. I think that for me is the most fundamental thing.
All right. Just going back to the Fitch Ratings findings, one of the key things that this agency has mentioned is that regarding high fiscal deficit, Fitch projects that this deficit for the year 2026 is at 5.8% of GDP, which is significantly rather higher than the government 4.7 target and the B median of 3.5%. Johnson, what are we seeing here?
Madness. I'll give you an example. I think it's the Maastricht Treaty, the treaty that establishes the EU monetary union. You're not supposed to exceed 3% of GDP, and budget deficit is not supposed to exceed 3% of GDP, and even then you're not supposed to do it in consecutive years. Here we just keep spending. I mean, we've run budget deficits of that order, in sometimes the order of 9-10% since 2012, right, till now. So you can imagine, of course, debt was always going to be a problem. And one of the things that also drives it is that the government has these lofty projections of economic growth. And because, that's the engine, right? And of course, that's a pitch. We're going to spend, and the spending is going to turn into economic growth, and we're going to be more prosperous. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is we are spending, there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of white elephants, we are developing, and this is just weighing down the government's balance sheet, and the debt is just piling up. So 5% additional, over this 12 months, right? We're already 6 months into it. 5% additional and that's how you're getting the bus left you at 65. We are approaching 90, right? Yeah, it's going quite fast. And like I said, there's a bit of breathing room because of dollar shenanigans, but it's not much. We need to get our house in order. And for this, of course, our National Assembly has really let us down.
When you talk about wastage and the white elephants, what do you refer to?
So all these investments, quote unquote, that require additional funding from the taxpayer every other year because they can't pay for themselves. So in fact, it's misuse of the word investment. An investment is supposed to yield a return. These ones don't.
What are some of the key investments that the government has embarked on that you could say have not yielded much returns or any returns at all, if any?
So if I can start with SGR, we've told that I think it has the largest numbers in terms of magnitude, in terms of losses. Then you have KQ is up there. And then you have guys like the sugar factories. It's a good thing they are privatized, but the sugar factories were also key drivers. I think the lab set projects, to this day, I don't know if there are too many exporters that use the port. Maybe, I was actually joking, I was just saying, maybe Lamu should be made an SEZ so that people can use those facilities. There's almost nobody using those facilities. So and it doesn't stop there. There are many, some of the banks that the government owns, a lot of the business the government owns, they are loss-making by nature. So, yeah.
And looking at what you're talking about, the wastage that, as you rightfully say, is evident from white elephants and, of course, institutions or projects the government or investments the government has embarked on that are not yielding returns. Like you say, an investment is supposed to give you returns, but that is not happening. So there's a lot of spending without returns. And if you look at, that kind of economic environment, and you consider also the kind of debt level we have right now, do you think the debt level we have is sustainable?
No, it's not. But what is also not very sustainable is when our behavior, or at least the government's behavior. Let me take myself out of that. I was not involved. The government's behavior. I mean, these guys keep spending as though there'll be manna that will fall from heavens tomorrow. The urgency, they kept talking about consolidation. That story has, I don't even think they speak about it anymore. I think they abandoned it when they started, when they were talking about revenue-driven consolidation, and that didn't work out because the debt is just rising too fast. So I think the re-election is now on the minds of these guys, and of course they believe that the pocket of the average Kenyan is not going to, is not a pitching point that they're going to use. So what else are they going to use? Tulijenga barabara, that's really what is left. So I think that's where, and maybe that's why the infrastructure fund was also developed, just to, get this pot of money, ring-fenced against the consolidated fund where the first charge is debt, so that you can be able to spend right into elections. I think that's a game plan now.
And Nelly, let's hear from you.
I'm going to pick up from the point he's just finished, and I'm glad he's brought it because I've observed a trend during electioneering period, and this goes as far as 2012. You have 1 year or 1.5 years left to the electioneering period. We also start seeing a rise in spending, the development that he's talking about. We are building roads. And my idea, even why when we started the show, I talked of the gap of the information, the informed citizenry, is because sometimes we hear of, as a citizen, you hear the president say, for example, we have bilateral talks. But as a citizen, you don't really know that that is a debt. Some of these projects, for example, the Nyota that is being presented to our youth, and I'm having a big issue with this project because it's being funded by World Bank. And when you look at that, it's coming in as a bilateral or a multilateral agreement that was somewhere between government and World Bank. And that is the uninformed citizenry effect that I'm talking about. Many of the citizenry, those not experienced technocrats like ourselves, don't really understand this and the magnitude of it. For example, when you take the Nyota program to the youth there, you're not considering all these licenses and taxes they need to pay before setting up a business. So you don't know if that 50,000 is really even enough for him to start the business before they even done with the whole registration and licensing processes. I'm going to shift my focus, or rather recommend maybe a shift to a focus in the domestic debt, because I feel it is a gap that is very overlooked, and because of the opaqueness. When you look at this all other external debts, there seems to be a streamlined structure of engaging and even implementing them. But when you come to the domestic state of the domestic public debt in our country, it's opaque in its whole process and existent, and even with its contracting. You look at the holders of the domestic public debt, it is restricted to a few people. That is the commercial banks Joseph is talking about. It is restricted to insurance companies only, and it is also restricted to a few wealthy individuals and locking out the public, the Kenyans. So the opaqueness that is handling of the domestic debt for me is really a gap, because that is also where we are experiencing high debt rates, for example, because the external ones are very open rather, and sometimes streamlined, as I've said. But the problem is in this domestic one, because when you look at that, for example, I don't want to quote names, but the banks that are in business of lending government, for example, they're owned by people, individuals, not government, not Leah, not Nelly, nor any of the taxpayers on this panel table. So that restriction for me creates sometimes also political interference, because some of the owners of these banks are just political elites and friends of the political class. So it's like we are restricting the whole public debt that is local to a few elites at the expense of Kenyans, because it is the Kenyans that face the impact in terms of taxation. It is Kenyans, the majority of the youths in this country, not able to start businesses because the crowding out that Ken was speaking about, government is locking out private sector. So therefore, if I'm a youth, I want to have a startup. A bank will not lend me credit, because if you look at me, if I'm starting a business and you look at government has more security than I. So banks will end up lending government more and locking out private sector. And that is how we're also seeing an increase in unemployment. And even, for example, in the universities in this country, we have close to, the auditors in this country did an audit of close to 83 schools, for example. They found out that out of the 83, you have like 18 having being ghost schools. These ghost schools receive funding from government capitation. But at the same time, we are speaking of literally schools in the marginalized areas in this country having received no capitation, or the capitation comes in late. So the sustainability of how we are even sustaining our education sector is a question mark. When you look at the calendar of our schools, it's very different from the financial calendar of the government. And that is how we are experiencing the delay in disbursement.
So there's a lot of impact on not
Yes.
just the education sector,
Yes.
of course, other sectors within
Yes.
the country.
Yeah.
Ken, when you look at the debt burden that Kenya is faced with, the general government debt is expected to remain, according to the Fitch agency, the assessment, the agency indicates that the debt is expected to remain high at 68.6% of GDP by the fiscal year 2027, which is above the peer median of 54.7%. When you hear Fitch saying that the debt is expected to remain high, I mean, what does that mean for the country?
No, it's very disappointing, Leah, because when this administration was campaigning in 2022, they kept saying, when you're in a hole, you stop digging. So the expectation we had from September 2022 was we're going to see more fiscal consolidation, reduction of debt, not just as a percentage of GDP, but even really in absolute terms. But that's not been there. The report talks about it's unlikely to get there, because it talks about things such as drought coming up, so there'll be spending pressures, and one can argue maybe drought is difficult to project, but things such as social pension funds payments, social security, those are things that can easily be planned ahead, because you know who's retiring and who'll need to pay more. So it's a bit disappointing that we didn't keep to that path of fiscal discipline, because had we done that, by now you'd have been getting to those levels of 55% that most of our classmates in that B- are. We are way out there. We are 12 percentage points above. So in a sense, Fitch is saying, we're almost doing you guys a favor. You know, we put you in a class B-, but the reality is you guys should be much lower. But we hope that this period we put in the B-, because there'll be other companies will be coming in. S&P, Moody's will be coming in. So it's in the best interest of the administration right now to take that report, really run with it, and say this is a time for fiscal consolidation. But as Johnson said, also the political economy, we are going into an election season where people want to see money flowing, money circulating. So you're caught between a rock and a hard place where you need to be consolidating, but the monies that need to be spent, because you need to finish projects so that you can showcase to Kenyans what you've done. You know, road contractors, there was a period last year that many of them had downed their tools because of pending bills. That was mostly in 2024. Last year, many of them got payments, so now they are back on the road, and many of them need to complete these projects because many governors and MPs need to run on that. So now the government will be caught in quite a difficult place where economists are telling you tighten a bit, but the political economy is telling you if you want to be re-elected, you need to finish. So these are the things that now they must really navigate over the next 18 months.
You know, Johnson, I hear conversations. Sometimes when you sit with, whether it's people from your circle of friends, sometimes you walk in the streets and you hear people are complaining. We are working very hard. The tax collection, the taxes are, they're very high. But when I listen to you all, you tend to wonder, where does the money go? Where is the money going? Because then if we can't service the debt of the country, then where is the money going? And sometimes some will question, is it going into perhaps campaigning, perhaps raising money for the election period to assist some in being able to fund their campaigns? I mean, those were questions and have been questions that have been circulating. I mean, you hear conversations out there and Kenyans, some of them, we interview them on various reports and you'll hear this conversation coming up. Johnson, what do you think?
No, I want to take a contrary position to what Nelly said. She said, debt is not bad. I think debt is dangerous. That amplifies your weaknesses and your strengths. So if you're solid guys, that will any debt you take will tend to work in your favor, I guess, given just the dispositions. But we know our politicians. We know them. We've allowed them to borrow in our name. And we know that 90% will be up to no good. There are many countries that have either put a brake on or sort of forbidden borrowing by their politicians. Like I know Brazil have what we call a balanced budget amendment. So the government is not allowed to spend beyond a certain amount, percentage. I'm not even sure they're allowed to go into deficit. Dilma Rousseff was impeached because she broke that law, right? Germany have a debt break. Italy have a balanced budget amendment. Switzerland have a balanced budget amendment. US has a roundabout way. They've managed to get over it, but they had a roundabout way of managing how much taxes they collect and how much debt can be issued. So many countries have tried to control borrowing. We left it to the elite, the political elite, to do it for us, and we are going to pay for it.
Is there another way the country can go about that?
We can do a referendum and put in a balanced budget amendment. Because if we keep letting this guy spend, I mean, the disposition is just not to, there's no prudence. Prudence for them is an alien word.
All right. When we look at, according to these findings, of course, one of the key other areas mentioned is the revenue underperformance, talking about structural weaknesses in tax collection persisting, with revenue expected to reach only 17.2% of GDP in fiscal year 2026, below the 17.4% government target. I have this question. Given these revelations from the agency, does that perhaps project that Kenyans might face more taxation, you think?
It'd be very brave for them to raise tax rates right now. but never say never. Yeah, I mean, when push comes to shove, what happens? So it's two options. Either you print money, cut spending, or you raise tax rates. I'm not sure the economy can take any higher tax rates We're already quite uncompetitive as it is right now. And you can see the outcomes in terms of jobs, dying companies, investors leaving for better environments. So it will be imprudent. I still insist, even from an economic perspective, even from a political perspective at this point, fiscal consolidation is actually smart policy, because when you let the debt run amok, it can have severe consequences. I mean, we've seen the likes of Sri Lanka, because all this actually originates from debt. Political instability is a real risk when debt becomes too much.
All right. And as we almost come to a close, can we look at, of course, the budget reading not too far from now, tying it with what we've seen from the findings from Fitch agency, the fact that, of course, we're not doing very well in terms of debt repayment. Of course, some of the challenges mentioned is governance, and like you've also rightfully mentioned, Johnson, is overspending, about a lot of wastage. What do you think this might be in terms of impact on the budget that's supposed to be read this year?
I mean, so far the indications we are getting is there'll still be aggressive revenue mobilization. If you look at the closing of the nil tax sort of option, you can't really file a nil tax. That option is no longer available. If you look at the proposal to have all your expenditures must be supported by an eTIMS invoice, that will lock out a lot of people. So all these are things that are targeted towards aggressive revenue mobilization, including also the e-procurement. One of the things that people are starting to realize is for you to be compliant with the e-procurement, you must also have a tax compliance certificates. So we might not go the 2024 direction of putting taxes on everyday products that could trigger that Gen Z outrage. Remember, that time we were saying tax on bread, tax on sanitary towels, and these things were very, triggered a lot of animosity. We're going to see a more sophisticated revenue mobilization, more on using technology to get more out of existing players, existing businesses. So businesses might be under pressure. Some of them might respond by laying off people. So it'll still hit the ordinary Mwananchi, but it's going to be similar to what we saw last year, a more indirect. I think the days of what we saw in 2024, those ones are long behind us. It's going to be more of hitting the business community a bit more aggressively. But what that does is really it triggers unemployment, and that still ends up hurting the ordinary Kenyans. It's a bit more indirect, but we expect to see a bit more revenue, a bit more aggressive revenue mobilization.
All right, let's just hear from all of you as we come to a close. Interesting conversation. Of course, as we look at the Kenya debt outlook today, and as I listen to you, it doesn't look very promising. I know Nelly tried to argue that debt is not always bad, but Johnson says if you can't pay the debt, it's bad. Then it affects every other thing, from the sectors you mentioned, education, of course, the health sector, the agriculture sector. But let's just hear from you, your final remarks about today. And by the way, just to mention about the negative rating action of the assessment, talking about higher debt servicing risk, for example, due to sustained increase in debt interest costs. Of course, not forgetting greater external financing strains and sharp decline in international reserves. Quite a few things there that have been mentioned, not even a few, there's a lot that's been mentioned in that report. And giving a light to these issues, I wish we had more time to discuss everything because the report really does highlight quite a lot. But I believe what we've been able to talk about today really just does make sense. But your final remarks, let's begin with you, Johnson.
I think, and this goes down to the ordinary Kenyan. It goes down to how you elect your MP. Historically, we've been doing this. We've been, looking at MP's performance on the basis of CDF. But that is exactly the wrong metric to use in the quality of your MP. The best measure would be how well he protects you from an exuberant government. So you need to look at which MP will protect you from a spendthrift in government, and that really ought to be, because that's your first line of defense. If we had done this at the previous elections, we would not be in this position.
All right, 15 seconds, Nelly.
All right. My final idea would be, in a country that transacts through mobile phones, I don't think the public debt should be left to a few individuals, because we have a country that we need to really, and my fingers are pointing at our oversight, the parliament institution. We are pointing at that because many times we've seen scenarios of debt ending up not being in the consolidated fund, and that is how budgeted corruption comes in. So I think we don't need to leave debt in the hands of a few people in a country that transacts money through mobile phones.
All right, Ken, let's hear from you.
I'd say we need an economic growth that creates jobs, especially jobs for Gen Zs. And that can only happen when government reduces its own borrowing activity, when the private sector accesses credit and expands. So it's in the best interest for the government to reduce its involvement in the borrowing market and allow the private sector to create jobs.
All right. Thank you so much for making time. Johnson and Derry, a finance expert, thank you for coming. Also, we have Nelly Chepkemoi, a policy and advocacy manager at the We Care organization. Thank you also for coming. And Ken Gishinga, chief economist at Mentoria Economics. It was lovely having this discussion with you all. That was a discussion about Kenya's debt outlook. Of course, quite a number of things highlighted throughout the discussion. We are glad that you have remained with us until this moment. My name is Leangare, and our sign language interpreter earlier on was Philip Omondi. As always, it's a pleasure that you remain with us, and we do hope to continue bringing you discussions where we try and make sense for you, break down the numbers for you, and make it all palatable for you to understand. Thank you again for watching. Have a good night, and God bless you.